All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Jordan Peterson, and I'm here with Seamus McDonald. Seamus, just for those that don't know anything about you,
Yes.
who are you?
Who am I? So that's my name, obviously. I live in Sydney, in Australia. I grew up in Wollongong, and I went to theological college in Sydney with the thought that I would go into overseas mission work. That's where I first learnt. That's technically I started biblical Greek before I got to college. I was keen. I was eager. So I went through there at Moore College. I studied for 4 years there. Went into some parish ministry before doing anything else. So I worked in some churches in Sydney and did a Master's of Theology as well, particularly focused on Greek stuff, early church fathers, that kind of thing. Then I went to Mongolia. So I served in Mongolia for 3 years in a small theological college there, teaching particularly master's students, a lot of New Testament exegesis, some other things. Came back to complete a PhD. So I completed a PhD about 5 years ago, looking at Basil and Hilary and kind of Trinitarian debates and Greek and Latin. And now here I am. This is my beautiful office where most days I work, teaching Latin and Greek online to the world.
Fantastic. I'm also from Wollongong. I didn't realize you grew up in Wollongong. So yeah, I grew up in Wollongong and I went to Moore Theological College from 2015 to 2018. And I'm not quite as qualified as my brother, Seamus here. But yeah, I got a Bachelor of Divinity doing 4 years there. And I'm an assistant pastor at Cornerstone Church in Christchurch, New Zealand. So Seamus, for those who are new to the discussion, what languages was the Bible originally written in, and why are we as teachers of the Bible so interested in learning those languages?
Sure. So the Bible was written in three main languages, well, two main languages and one kind of small language. The Old Testament was primarily written in Hebrew, what we call biblical Hebrew or classical Hebrew, except for a few portions, parts of Daniel, and were written in Aramaic, which is a related language. And then the New Testament was written in Greek, in the ancient Greek of the time, which we typically call Koine Greek. And yeah, I mean, Bible teachers and those involved in Bible ministry are interested in the languages because we're interested in these texts and believe that, you know, God has spoken through them. So obviously we want to get into these texts, particularly in the way that they were written and in the language they were written, so we can, in a sense, come closer to the meaning or get a better grasp. Or I think often what I tell people is we're trying to get rid of one layer of interpretation or one layer of filtering between us and the text, which is translation.
Yeah, and there's a vibe that comes through in languages that is sometimes missed in translation, isn't there?
I think so, yeah. So partly I think vibe is a great word. Like when you, and not just the Bible, but other, you know, any kind of, if you know another language and you have the experience of a text or a film or whatever in that language versus in translation, you know that the feel is different. The feel is different. And often, it's not often that knowing the original language solves some, you know, magically solves some mystery of interpretation. But often it just makes you aware of the challenges and the difficulties of translation and what sort of issues there might be around that.
For sure. So what you've said is true for language learning, that there's a vibe and everything. What particular challenges are there in learning a dead language?
Yes.
Like because most people aren't going to go and order a kilo of tomatoes in classical Hebrew or Koine Greek.
No.
So what are the challenges that we face?
So when I talk about dead languages and living languages, and I talk about teaching with a living language approach, but I kind of make a distinction. So I talk about living languages, dead languages, and zombie languages. And what I mean by that is a dead language usually means a language that doesn't have native speakers and doesn't have intergenerational transmission. That is, parents aren't raising kids learning that language. There's no community around it. Zombie languages, this is a great term, I think. The zombie languages are languages that are spoken but lack that intergenerational transmission and lack a native speaker communities. And so This is particularly true for Latin. There are quite a few people who can speak Latin without any problems. But then most of them are not raising their kids speaking Latin. And even if they are, there's not really a community that they can grow up in. So it's alive, but it's also not changing, and it's dead in one sense. That's more true for Biblical Hebrew, even though modern Hebrew exists. It's a kind of a slightly different phenomenon. And ancient Greek. There are people who can speak these languages these days, but for the most part, no one is spending their days ordering kilos of tomatoes or lattes in these languages. So that does provide a number of challenges. You can't go to ancient Greekville and learn to speak Koine Greek. You can go to some immersion workshops, but you're not going to be spending your time watching the latest sitcom in ancient Greek or anything. It's challenging for a couple of reasons. One, sometimes we just don't know things. That is, if you're a second language learner of English and you're like, how do I say this, or what's the idiom for this, or how do people? You can find someone, you can find some way of finding out. Oh, this is how they said this. Sometimes for ancient languages, it's just not possible. We only have the text that we have, and if the answer's not there, or you don't know how to find it, you'll never know how X was said. You'll never know how, the best way to ask for kilo of tomatoes. The second problem is just it means that the resources available for language learning are much more limited. We don't have the same materials that we would for a living language.
Sure. And so faced with those challenges, people that want to learn the original languages, go to theological college or a seminary, they call it in the States. How are biblical languages traditionally taught in most theological colleges and seminaries? And what do you think is helpful about that approach? And what do you think can be unhelpful about that approach?
Right. So I would say in 98% of theological colleges, languages are taught in what we call a fairly traditional method. That's a bit of a misnomer in some ways. It's not, in the sense that it's not that traditional if you look at the kind of the history of language teaching over a good 2,000 years. But the focus is usually on what I call and what others call a grammar translation method. That is, you study the grammar rules, you study the rules of the language, and you study vocabulary, and then you come to a text, and what you do is you practice translating it. And you say, oh, this word means this, and here's the grammar rules, and I can produce an English translation. So you memorize paradigms, you memorize grammar rules, you memorize English or another language's meaning, glosses or meanings for words, and then you come to a passage and you kind of puzzle it out, and then you produce an English, and you hope that it looks something like the English translation you've already read often. Yeah. That's the dominant approach in most colleges. There's a very interesting book. I can't remember the author now, but he surveyed particularly evangelical colleges across the US in particular to see what sort of teaching were they using and what were the results particularly among pastors kind of post-college, and how little they were using that language. So it's a depressing read.
Yeah. So let's go there for a sec. So what is the outcome of really what's the outcome of people that are taught with that method that, as you've said, 98% of colleges use? What are we seeing from people that have been schooled that way?
I would say so what people come out of a Greek course like that, if they've done, particularly if they've done a couple of years it, what they're very good at is analyzing minutiae and saying, oh, this word passes to this, it's a noun in X space, or it's a verb, and this is its tense and its form, etc., etc. And often a little bit deeper, the syntax, what's going on, these kinds of things. They can be very good at this, but they find it very hard to maintain. And particularly what they find hard is, unless you've done, you can learn to read that way. Let me say, you can. So when I say reading, what I mean is picking up a text the way you pick up an English text or some other language, and reading it and just understanding it the way I pick up a newspaper and read it. Very few people can move from that kind of grammar translation to reading Greek fluently, naturally, without translating in their heads. It's possible, but I think it takes a lot longer. And so what that means is most people who've trained that way don't keep it up because they don't reach a point where they can read the Greek New Testament or the Hebrew Old Testament, they can't read it fluidly or fluently, and so it takes them a painstaking amount of time to translate through a passage. And if they keep that up, I mean, that skill will develop, but very often it doesn't.
I mean, yeah, it sounds pretty glum, and that definitely fits with my experience. So I did 4 years at college, and then I've had 3 years of full-time ministry out the back of college. So that's 7 years studying Hebrew and Greek. And until 9 months ago, if I picked up a Greek New Testament, or especially my Tanakh, my Hebrew Old Testament, I couldn't just read. I could, as you say, I'd have to pass words and things. But it sounds like you're suggesting there's a better way, Seamus, than this painstaking rote memorization of paradigms and conjugations. What is that way?
So there is a better way. Funny you should ask. It seems to me, so there's a field of research, we call it second language acquisition. This is kind of a subfield of linguistics that looks at how do people learn languages, particularly as adults, or at least post-adolescent. That seems to be a little bit different from how people learn languages as children. And I mean, there's disagreements in that field. Not everyone agrees about everything, but on the whole, the evidence and the research seems to suggest that if you're learning a living language, so this is part of the debate, you know, what does a living language and a dead language have that's different? If you're learning a living language, the thing that helps you learn is exposure to input, that is messages, that is reading or hearing and watching in the language that is comprehensible, that is you can understand it. So it needs to be at a level you can understand it, and it needs to be interesting. You need to be interested in it. So if it's not interesting, you won't pay attention to it. Anytime if you've ever seen a boring movie, like you stop paying attention. That's true of language as well. If you're not interested in what's being said, you stop paying attention. And it also has to be understandable. So if you're not understanding it, your brain will tune out and says, I don't understand. This is just words coming at me. And so if you have those things, and if you have enough of it, your brain starts to put together a kind of like an image, not like a visual image, but the brain puts together the patterns of the language and internalizes them as a language instead of a set of rules to be applied to a language. So there's a kind of a much more implicit and internalized and intuitive learning process going on. And to the extent that you can facilitate that, you can teach that way as well.
So, I mean, you know that, like, I'm totally on board with this method, because the last 9 months I've given it a good crack with my Hebrew and seen the results. But just to play the advocate of the old method, couldn't they just say, what do you mean the brain internalizes it? Like, are you suggesting there's just some sort of automatic mechanism that happens, and that doesn't work with anything? You have to learn things. You can't just kind of osmosis things.
I mean, that's partly it's about what type of learning is going on. And so this is another great example, in the sense that if you ask someone to analyze their native language, they're often wrong. That is, if you say, oh, is this a noun or a verb? They might have no idea. So you don't need to know that. You don't need to have that explicit knowledge to analyze, to speak a language. It's entirely possible to be, entirely unable to analyze the grammar of English. But if you ask someone, does this sound right? 9 times out of 10, they're gonna be right. And so it's 2 different types of knowledge, I would say. That is, and they both have a role to play, particularly, if you're doing analysis, if you're doing study, there is a role to play for grammatical analysis. There is that kind of, oh, well, this is what's going on. But you can have that knowledge without being able to use language, which plenty of linguists, if you talk to a linguist and you say, how many languages do they know? They get upset because they're like, that's not what linguistics is. But they have the tools to analyze language, because that's one type of knowledge. It's another skill set and another way of learning to be able to process and use a language, which is much, I don't think it's exactly the same as skills in general, but it's much more down the skill kind of thing than a kind of a theoretical framework.
So what we're talking about, the difference between analyzing the fluid dynamics that's going on in swimming versus being able to swim well.
Right, right. So and I mean, I come up with a lot of analogies, but the difference between a coach and an athlete is a really good one. Coaches can be as unfit as you like, but still excellent coaches. Yeah. They can sit on the sideline and tell you everything. And, you know, armchair coaches who have never played the game at all could be excellent coaches. They can sit there and say, you know, player X should have done this, they should have done that, what's going on here? But it's a whole nother different thing to play the game. The same with language, I'd say. It's one thing, and it's an important and great skill to be able to sit on the sideline and say, oh, this is what's going on here. And it's another thing to be there kind of using the language in the moment.
Yeah. So let's this is I'm finding it very interesting, and people may be finding it interesting, but let's bring this down to earth. So what are we actually suggesting, Seamus, about the way that things currently are taught in terms of teaching biblical languages, and what could be? What sort of ideal are you suggesting could exist?
Right. So in my dream world, in my dream world, so this is you would change your method and you would change your expected outcomes, and you'd have to change both at the same time. And so you change your method to say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to spend most of our time, particularly in class time, live time, is going to be spent using the language. And so most of what students are going to receive is messages in Greek or Hebrew. At the start, very simple messages, single sentences, things, and you know, and just it's the difference between having a class that's 95% in English and then 5% in Hebrew, to having a class that's 95% in Hebrew, 5% in English. So that the bulk of that time is spent giving students exposure to the language, either things they can read or things that they can hear, and ideally both. And then we would change our outcome expectations. Because I think if you do that, and if you do it well, the outcome is people who can pick up and read the New Testament, the Old Testament, Greek and Hebrew relatively fluently. Not without any problems. There's always going to be, you know, little stumbling blocks. But can pick it up and read it at length without great difficulty. And to some extent, you can build it. So you can't just do that. You can just do an outcome that's focused on reading, but you can also, and I think this is helpful, you can also produce the abilities at a lesser degree to speak and to write in those languages.
Well, look, Seamus, it sounds like really good in theory, your ideas, but I mean, where's the proof that this whole language acquisition by subconscious learning, where's the proof that it's actually possible to learn that?
Right. So I think the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. So there are places doing this kind of thing. Not many theological colleges. Often they're kind of extra college entities where this type of teaching is going on, and you can see the results in people, and you can see people who are doing this kind of teaching in various contexts. And so I think if you look at them, I think people would actually be, you know, if you've never looked up any of these people, you'd be amazed at kind of what is possible. That is, there is a position that says, but you can't do that. You just can't do that. But if you look, I mean, they're all on, not all of them are on YouTube. Many of them are on YouTube. You can watch a video of them, and you can see these people talking fluent ancient Greek, fluent Koine Greek without any problem. And so I can rattle off some people, my favorites. So the Biblical Languages Center in Israel, it's kind of spearheaded by Randall Booth, has done pioneering work in this area for decades. Christoph Rico, who runs the Polis Institute, has done a lot of work in Greek and in other languages as well, but particularly Greek. The people involved with Biblingo, which is a software app, which is designed to kind of apply this method through a kind of a website to get you reading.
And how about you?
How about me?
Yeah, is this just some idea that you think is interesting?
So this is what I do now. I don't do Hebrew. I did study Hebrew, and I have taught Hebrew exegesis, but it's not on my strong suit at the moment, and I'm not sure it's going to come back anytime soon.
Don't be such a pessimist.
I have hopes, but I'm also a realist. So what I do most of my days is I teach online classes for Greek and Latin, and I teach people mostly by this method. A little bit different to how I would do it in the classroom, because online has its own kind of constraints. But my goal is to get most of our classes 95% into the language. And so students who come in as beginners with me start from 0 or just past 0, but I have a lot of people who've done Greek before and come back to kind of start again. So they're cheating a little bit, but not too much. And so through the beginner classes, we're reading easy stuff. We're talking in easy Greek. I'm asking them questions in Greek. They're answering to the best of their ability. And then in the advanced classes, we're just reading. It's book club. That's not one of my students called it. It's book club, but in ancient languages.
So you can just pick up a New Testament with these guys and just
right. Yeah. It depends on the difficulty. So the New Testament. So I can pick up the New Testament without a reader's edition now. Praise God. So I don't really need much vocab help. Occasionally I'll come across a word I don't know, but maybe one a page, and read it and understand it without any difficulty.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's true of my experience. I'm not at that level yet. I think I said to you, I thought I was B2, but as I've reflected, I'm probably more like high A2 or like low B1 in my Hebrew.
Right. I think those kinds of standards are always very difficult to gauge in the sense that they are multifaceted, they are multi-skilled, they're domain specific. So, you might be A1 at something, you might be B2 at something else, etc. Most people find that eventually, over time, their reading ability is always the best, and everything else lags behind.
So reading, you're saying, is key, like just kind of reading.
Reading is key for a couple of reasons. One, it's low stress. If there's no one else watching you, you can take as long as you like, right? And you can look up things you don't understand, and you can reread. So those are all things in its favor. Secondly, there's more to read than any other kind of. If you talk about 4 skills, speaking, listening, writing. Speaking and writing are kind of different because you can only speak and write mostly what you've already internalized.
Yeah.
But for Greek, there's tons of things you can read. There's not as much easy stuff as we would like, and so some of my time is spent writing stuff and producing things that might be useful to learners. Hebrew is a different kind of challenge for that because there's less. Well, there's very classical Hebrew or biblical Hebrew is really the Bible.
Yeah.
There's not a broader literature that you can really dive into. But at the same time, there are people producing resources that are oriented towards learners. So that's why reading is so good, because reading is on your own time. You can review and reread as many times as necessary, and you can get through a lot more. You can just get through a lot more reading than you can listening. Listening is a more taxing skill, and there's less out there to listen to.
Yeah, I think something that has shocked me since I took this approach. So 7 years of just the traditional grammatical translation approach, and then going, why can I still not really understand the Hebrew or Old Testament?
Right.
I went, something is going on here. And
so
I've changed tactics. I'm 9 months in of pretty consistently just reading.
Yeah.
And I'm actually at the point where I can pick up the Old Testament now and just read it without having to translate into English in my head. Not everything, obviously, but simple stories, Jonah, and 2 Chronicles, things like that.
Yeah.
I think the thing that shocked me was just the gradual nature of that progress.
Yeah.
I don't know how it happened. It just seems to be like this magical thing that if you just start reading it, and that's in a 9-month window as opposed to 7 months or 7 years. Sorry. Yeah. So I suppose a question I've got is why aren't more theological colleges kind of seeing the benefit of that?
Yeah, I think more are over time. I think there's a few factors why, and one, biblical languages, particularly biblical language teaching, exists in a little bit of its own silo. So I'd say historically, the interaction between, I do much more Greek, so I know much more about the Greek scene, but people involved in New Testament Greek and people involved in broader classical Greek don't talk to each other very much as disciplines. They do a little bit, and not everyone's like that, but what's going on in the broader classical Greek world and what's going on in the Koine New Testament Greek sphere are often not talking to each other and not knowing what's going on. Two, everyone who teaches has a strong tendency to teach the way they were taught. It takes a lot to retrain the way you're taught to do something different. So unless you're specifically taught to teach Greek in a different way, what you're going to do is what you're comfortable with. And the people who succeed in New Testament studies and tend to become teachers tend to be people who are good at grammar translation, and so they enjoy it. I enjoy it too. Well, I enjoy grammar, but I'm convinced that's not the way to teach. But I find it fascinating nonetheless.
So you're a phenomenon in that.
Well, I think a lot of people who are now doing this would say the same. They would say, I was fascinated by grammar, I was fascinated by linguistics. And so all that stuff remains interesting to me, and I want to know that stuff, but I don't think it drives the kind of learning that I want students to have and that I want to, and myself. Thirdly, I mean, there's just kind of institutional momentum issues. That is, it's hard to change the way things are done. So I've seen this in a few contexts where the powers that be have set out course outlines, expectations, and it's all built around grammar translation. So even if I want to teach a different way, the structures are saying, no, the outcomes need to be parsing, grammar, syntax, translation. So I think there's a bit of that as well. I think probably the last factor is just growth over time. And so I had a similar experience where, one of the reasons I got into this was really my experience of Latin. And I got to the end of doing a Latin kind of course of 4 years and said, how come translating Latin is so difficult for me? Whereas, over in the French and German departments, I presume, I never tested this, but I presume that the people finishing those degrees can just speak German and French, can watch German and French movies, write papers in German and French, etc. But that was clearly not the case for Latin. And so at that stage I was like, but why not? And then I realized, well, there are Latin teachers that were doing this kind of thing. And the movement towards a comprehensible input-based approach and this kind of thing in Latin has always been much stronger than Greek. And the kinds of things that I'm seeing now in Greek resources and Greek teaching, it's probably a 20-year lag from what Latin has already done. And so then New Testament Greek as a subset is even further behind, I would say. But I think that's changing, particularly as more people see what's possible. And the other thing is, if you experience it yourself, you do have a kind of a mini conversion moment, I reckon.
Totally. I'm on the bandwagon.
And even people who are just starting off, if you get to the point where you can read a simple parable through without translating in your head and just understanding and speaking it aloud, maybe asking some basic questions about it, then suddenly, you do realize, oh, it's possible. And it's amazing. It's kind of just, it's amazing.
Yeah. Like particularly, I've found reading Old Testament narrative, when I read in English in the Old Testament narrative, there's just this clunkiness about things. Like the stories don't flow in the same way that a story that I'd tell my kids flows. Yep. But then when you have enough of a grasp of Hebrew that you can pick it up and just read the stories, you go, oh, it's just a story. Like and the language lends itself to, you get caught up in the plot in a way that it's not easy to get caught up in the plot of the English translation, but it is in the Hebrew. Another question is, do you recommend trying to learn Greek and Hebrew at the same time, or do you think it's better to go deep into one for a couple of years and deep into another for a couple of years?
I think it depends a lot on context. So what I tell people generally is, if you want to learn more than one language, you've just got to think of it as a division game, right? So if you're learning one language and you've got X hours, that's X hours for one language. But if you learn two, suddenly you've halved it. And that's actually a huge difference. And if you add 3 or 4, and then you get, young people who want to learn all these languages say, oh, I'm going to study 7 languages at once. Well, suddenly your time split between 7 languages, you're not going to make much progress on each of them.
Yeah.
But I would qualify that by saying, if you're at a theological college, that is the time to go deep, because you're in a period of your life where you've set it aside for study, and you'll probably never have that amount of free time again and that amount of resources. And so you might as well go at least on both, that is Hebrew and Greek. I think very few people learn Aramaic by itself. Most people who learn Aramaic do it after they've got a good deal of Hebrew under their belt. So that's the time, if you're in that context where you've got the time, then make use of it. Because particularly if you go into ministry, it's possible to maintain languages in ministry. It's much harder to pick up languages in ministry and go deep, because there will always be pressures on your time. And very few people in your ministry context are going to be saying, if probably no one, but
Please,
maybe
learn more Hebrew.
I mean, no one's going to be saying you should spend a bit more time in your week in private study of Greek language.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to see they won't connect the benefits of it. Like, putting it another way, my knowledge of Hebrew affects my preaching of the Old Testament in a really big way.
Yeah.
Because I have a grasp and a certainty of what the text is saying that I don't necessarily have in English. And that comes out in my sermons, but they're not necessarily going to connect the increasing engagement of my sermons with my reading of Jonah. And what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, my routine every day at the moment is to fit my Hebrew reading in. I get up at 5:30 and I read between 5:30 and 6:10 a.m. and then my kids all wake up and the chaos starts. So it does take a sacrifice once you're well and truly into full-time ministry to try and make it work. What point, because I know a lot of these, like the popular people that have popularized language acquisition and comprehensive input, Stephen Krashen, Steve Kaufman, like Matt First Japan, all these polyglot YouTubers, they will often say, just expose yourself to enough of the language and then the ability to speak it will just it'll come. Is that true of Greek and Hebrew, or is it not quite true?
I think it's true, but I don't think people, so some people advocate for what they call a silent period. They say, just at the start, just read or listen and don't worry. Some people are even stronger. They don't even say don't worry about it. They say don't speak. I don't hold that position, but I do think that the main thing that's going to drive the development of your understanding of the language is input, so listening and reading. And so in one sense, you don't need to speak for a while. In fact, you never need to speak actually, but it is useful, I would say. And the reason, so it's useful for a couple of reasons. One, if you've ever tried to learn a language, any language, there is a big difference between subvocalizing or thinking, oh, I'm going to say this, and then actually speaking it. And if you know that gap, it's like, everything you say kind of, subvocally or just kind of mentally preparing sounds perfect, comes out perfectly. But as soon as you actually open your mouth, like words don't flow off your tongue melodiously or anything like that. It takes practice to kind of get words out of your mouth. And I think that's a useful thing to do. And partly you can do that. You can do that by reading aloud, actually reading aloud, not just kind of mumbling aloud. Two, what speaking does is it pushes you in new directions, and in particular, speaking with other people. So obviously you need other people to do that, whether it's kind of, if you get a buddy or a group or whatever going, or you go to some classes online or in person. It brings out different aspects of the language that you won't get from reading as much. So for example, if you're reading, you'll predominantly be exposed to third-person forms because most of your reading is going to be narrative about X, Y, Z. The forms you're going to be least exposed to are second-person forms because that requires dialogue. But if you're in a conversation, if you're asking about the tomatoes, you're much more likely to use second-person forms. So there are linguistic kind of differences about what type of language you'll use. And the other thing is you get a sense of where your gaps are, because you'll go to say something, you'll say, "Oh, I don't know what that, I don't know how to say this," and so then you might go away and go, "Oh, I don't know how to say this. I want to figure it out." And you also get exposed to different choices. So everyone has their own kind of vocab preferences, for example. And if you're only kind of working on your own, you tend to fossilize in them. Here's a good example. So I tend to use the word isos in Greek to mean perhaps, and that's kind of a more classical choice, more Attic choice. Whereas people who've gone through certain teaching and people who've picked it up a more New Testament vocabulary tend to use tacha. And so I need to hear that to remind myself, there's another option here, that kind of thing. Or even if it's not for that, it's kind of a dialect difference, but not a very big one. But just being aware that there are other options and how other people might say things is kind of helpful to kind of broaden. Because I think one of the things, more so for Greek than Hebrew, because there's a broader Greek corpus that can be read, is your knowledge of choices and differences and different ways things can be said is expanded just by reading more, and that gives you a better sense of different. If you talk about the Gospels, the different styles of the four Gospels. If all you read is the four Gospels, it's hard to know that. Usually, you can compare between them. But if you read a bit more broader Greek literature, you get a sense of, this is interesting and this isn't, which is something I think seminary students or theological students often struggle with. When they get the second year and write exegetical papers, they're like, this word is significant. This word is significant. This word only appears once. These kinds of things, but often they're just not. And so. What a broader knowledge of the language does for you is you get a feel, and so sometimes you can do it explicitly. You can say, well, if we look at these different authors, so and so uses it this way, so and so uses X times, 5 times, 14 times, right. But it's really helpful to just have a vibe for it, just to say, this feels a little unusual. I wonder why, or to feel or to be able to say, this is totally normal. This is an unusual. Maybe it's unusual in this book, but it's quite common in Greek, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so speaking can also get you to that point as well. And also speaking it just keeps feeding. So if you're speaking with someone else, they're giving you input, and you've got to process it, and it's just a different form of,
in the context of relationship with someone as well, which is gonna your lived experience is a really powerful teaching tool. So practically speaking, so at the moment I'm doing like probably half an hour to 40 minutes of reading in the morning, and I do some sentence mining as well, which we haven't really talked about, but basically grabbing phrases from the Hebrew that might have one word that I'm not familiar with and putting it in Anki, the flashcard system. So I'm doing maybe 30, 40 cards of that a day. After 2 or 3 years, like what should I expect my reading proficiency to have come to, or do you just plateau and you don't really get past a certain point?
I think so. Expectations about progress are people often say, how many years, and people ask me this, they say, how many years should it take to get to this point? And I don't like to tell them, because it took me a lot longer in years than I think it ought to have, because I just didn't know. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know there were these kinds of approaches. And so what I tell people is, firstly, you don't measure progress in years. Years is a worthless measurement. Hours is a worthful measurement. That is, it's a big difference if if you study Japanese for years, but you've only done an hour a year. That doesn't mean anything, right?
800 years or something like that.
Right. So measuring in hours, and I don't normally tell people to do this, but it is a useful experiment for to self-reflect and say, to map your hours. Say, this week I did so many hours. I wouldn't compare with other people. I don't think that's very helpful. But I do think, so if you have a regular habit of set time, particularly set time a day, I think in a couple of years, it's quite possible to reach a level where you can read the New Testament or the Old Testament with a reasonable degree of fluency. At that level, I would probably say still with a reader's edition, where kind of less common vocabulary is footnoted on the bottom. I think they're great. I think to get to a point where you can read it without footnotes is more years, particularly. So words that are infrequent, there are always words that are infrequent in any text. And the only way you're going to get them is if you have much more language, read a lot more other things, or if you just come back to that passage again and again and say, that word, I never remember that word, and you look it up, and eventually you'll have to stop looking it up. You'll be like, that word.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's just any text. It's not just, it's not just biblical text. Any text, Zipf's law tells you that there's always going to be these less frequent words, and they're always going to be less frequent. Yeah. In terms of the plateau, though, one thing I talk about with people is there is an intermediate plateau, and it's really long. It's a really long plateau.
I know, I'm in it. It's
right,
terrible.
And it's fine to be on it. Like you get on it, and you look, and you can't see the end of the plateau, but it's there, and it's just this plateau has a long kind of slope. They're so gradual.
It does end, right?
Right, it does end. It does end. And it ends in a way you won't know that it's ended, because you'll get there and you're like,
I guess I can read.
I guess I'm here, wherever here is.
When did I get here? I don't remember.
Right. So it's like, in one sense it's okay, in the sense that I think that plateau, as long as you keep going on that plateau, you're always making progress. And it might be very gradual, it might be imperceptible, but it's there.
I think that, and that's that progress idea is key, because what I think the thing I entered into my relationship with Hebrew 9 months ago thinking was, if I just hammer this out, then in 3 years I'll be able to, read Song of Songs without any difficulty, which may or may not be true. But the thing that I'm coming to realize more and more is you have to just fall in love with the language itself, so that you stop caring about the endpoint, and you just, it's become more and more of just a fun, interesting puzzle solving game that I do every morning, and less of it just butting my head against a brick wall trying to figure out what these symbols mean. So I suppose just putting it back into, because I'm a pastor, and the reason that I asked you if we could talk was because I know that the number of pastors, the number of friends I have who are in pastoral ministry, who have a good grasp of Hebrew, like Greek, let alone Hebrew, is just rapidly dwindling as the years post-college come. And as someone that's now getting some degree of proficiency in reading Hebrew, I'm just going, oh, there's just so much that these brothers are losing by not being able to have this. What would you say to the pastor that just says, or the Bible teacher that says, look, it is a shame that I'm losing it, but I don't really need to know the original languages to be a good teacher of the Bible. I can just use commentaries in my sermon preparation.
I want to say actually, there are some people in ministry for whom, not for whom it wouldn't be good to learn the languages, but you might look at your ministry situation and say, I don't have time to prioritize this right now.
Sure.
I don't think that's true of many people, but I think some people might look around and say, I'm involved in this, and it's not as important, particularly if you're kind of down your ministry career, you're a long way down, you're involved in frontline evangelism all the time, and it's just not going to be that, I think you can make that choice. I don't think it's an absolute, you must learn the languages, repent now.
So there's not really much at stake. Just to give you a poke. But
what people need to see is the value of the language. That's the thing that's going to motivate them anyway. So and partly that's taste and see, of course, taste and see that the Lord is good, but taste and see that the languages are good. And the way it pays off in that tasting and seeing is, most people are unlikely to get to the point where they're better than the translation they pick up. But you might disagree with it, but it does take a lot of confidence to get to a point where you say, I think the NIV is wrong here, ESV is wrong here. You're not trying to outsmart professional scholars necessarily, but you're trying to enter that conversation so that when you pick up a commentary and it says XYZ about the Greek or XYZ about the Hebrew, you can actually, one, understand what they're talking about, and two, evaluate it to some degree. You might not have the ability to say whether it's right or wrong, but you need to be able to kind of to understand where they're coming from, why they would say that, and that kind of thing. That's still partly a kind of extra linguistic knowledge, not just a reading knowledge, but a reading, a fluid kind of comprehensible kind of knowledge is going to take you a long way to saying, that's not the vibe I get. But more than that, more than assessing the resources you have, I think it transforms your own relationship with the Bible. Not in some kind of, I have secret knowledge, now finally I can understand the true meaning of the scriptures. It's much more subtle than that. And it's a bit like what you were saying before, you pick it up and you read it, and if it's just a story, it feels like a story. I think that lets you enter into the world of the scriptures in a more vivid way. And that's what I'm finding, myself lately. As I read the New Testament, and because my Hebrew is so weak, I read the Old Testament in Greek, which is its own fun experience. It becomes more vivid. And I feel, I'm more in that world, and I'm feeling the rhythms and the patterns of the speech, the way it was written. And so it's just a commitment to, okay, if you're involved in ministry, particularly if you're involved in a teaching ministry, I do think you have an obligation to keep going deeper into the scriptures. And if you don't have the languages, you will hit a wall where you can't go deeper in your knowledge.
Mm.
You can go deeper in your knowledge with God, but your scholarly teaching knowledge will hit a wall, I think. And that's where the languages kind of carry you through.
And also just confidence in God's word. Like I suppose if you don't know, like for example, if you don't have Greek and you're working through Romans, there's a lot of good commentators out there, Stott, Schreiner, whoever. And if they're saying different things and you've got different translations and they're talking about the Greek, then as you say, you can't evaluate, you can't enter into the conversation. So your tendency is going to be to go with the guy that you like the most.
Yeah, absolutely. That's most people's tendency.
Because you go, oh, well, Stott can't be wrong because he's Stott. Yeah, so that's the risk. And so what about the person that says, look, it's great that works for you guys. I'm just going to keep going on with paradigms and grammar rules because that's what I like.
So, I mean, look, there's always someone wrong on the internet, and it's no longer my job to correct them.
There's enough outrage on the internet.
Look, I think there are kind of arguments that can be made that kind of, you can say, okay, well, let's look at this, let's look at this, let's look at the linguistics, let's debate about this, get people to read different things and say, well, is this approach delivering what you want? I think there's a place for that. I feel like in my life, I've done enough of the reading to say, what, I'm not going to spend my time arguing necessarily on that basis. So I think it comes back to saying, well, what are the outcomes and are you happy with the outcomes? And won't you try it? That's what I would say to people. So, the outcomes of memorizing paradigms, et cetera, you can look at that and you can see both in teachers and in students and say, is that the outcome we want? And if it's not the outcome, if it's not delivering the outcome we want, we ought to do something different. And then I would just say, try something, give a communicative approach a try. These days, there's plenty of options. Can come to my classes, of course, but there's plenty of other people doing different things. Give it a try, see what it's like. And if you're still convinced that it's a waste of time and it's not producing the outcome, that's fine. At least you gave it a try. Like at the end of the day,
I wasted 3 years of my life for this. No, you won't get to that point.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, look, it's not a money back guarantee, but I think many people have come from a very negative point of view and have had an experience and have gone, it is possible and it's fun and it's worthwhile.
Totally. I was going to end there, but I just thought of one good bonus question. Last one. Where does entering into the world of the biblical languages help with cross-cultural mission and ministry?
Right. First, two ways. One, when we're reading the Bible, we're always involved in a cross-cultural communicative event because our culture is not the same as the biblical cultures. And so language and culture are always intertwined. And so if you really want to engage cross-culturally, you have to deal with language. And that's true of our encounter with the biblical text. We're involved in a cross-cultural communication event mediated by text. And so part of our cross-cultural journey to understand the text is to understand it in its context, and that involves the languages. Two, I think it's vitally important for mission contexts or cross-cultural contexts, not just mission contexts. And this is something I never fully succeeded to do in Mongolia, partly because of various factors. But when you understand that languages can be taught via themselves, that is, you can learn Greek through Greek. You don't need English, and you don't need grammatical description necessarily to teach Greek. And same with Hebrew. So my experience in Mongolia was that Mongolian students learnt the grammar. I didn't teach them the grammar, but they had another teacher who taught them Greek grammar via an English textbook translated into Mongolian. And so there was this very circuitous route for them to get, they had to, a lot of them were learning English anyway, but They need to access English resources. They need to access all these resources in a second language for them in order to come back to the Greek and then translate the Greek into Mongolian.
Mm.
And this is even worse in other contexts. And so in a cross-cultural context, if you have the ability to understand the biblical languages in themselves and then teach them in that way, you can, in one sense, circumvent the necessity of so-and-so person in cross-cultural language and culture going via English and via everything bound up in our cultural and our linguistic traditions. They have a chance to go from their language to the biblical languages.
Yeah, especially, I suppose, because often we project English grammatical categories into the biblical languages or other languages, but a lot of the concepts in English grammar, they're things that English-speaking grammarians have recognized.
Yeah,
and I suppose linguistics is trying to map, the grammar that's common to all language or whatever. But yeah, and I think something I've found as well is it's reminded me that I'm a foreigner to, like I'm a Gentile coming to God's promises, and I'm reading this text that I've always had in my heart language and thought, oh, well, this is something that I'm familiar with, and it's reminding me, oh no, I am thousands of years and cultures apart from the people that God was speaking to back then. And so in some ways it gives me empathy for the stranger that I'm meeting in New Zealand and trying to tell the gospel to, and reminds me that English is not somehow an easier language to learn than Hebrew, than Chinese, than Mongolian or whatever. It's just, this is the language I grew up in. And so anyway, that's all I got. That's all my bullets.
Excellent.
I grilled you. Thanks heaps, Seamus. Appreciate it.